Hello, this is Ali Moore. I am the founder and CEO of X Factor Solutions. We're an organization that focuses on organizational and culture change, strategy development, leadership development, and also diversity, equity, and inclusion. When I talk about this topic, a lot of people want to lump everything into one of those categories, either diversity or equity or inclusion. And in fact, they are three completely different topics. This morning, we're going to talk about leadership's responsibility in supporting a diverse and equitable organizational culture. This has many facets. It's different for different organizations, right? You have to start with where you want to be as an organization, what you stand for, and move on from there. So it's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm going to offer some suggestions, some tips, things that you can incorporate into your business. But at the end of the day, it's up to you to determine how important something like this is to you. The very first thing that people ask is, when discussing leadership's role or responsibility, how do you define leader, or how do you define a leader? In my opinion, a leader is much more than a position or a title. While obviously C-level executives are leaders, a leader can be anyone who has a vision for improvements in their respective organization. Anyone who wants to improve over the status quo and then enable, support, and rally people to progress toward that future vision. So regardless of your title, if you have a vision or a future vision, then you could be considered a leader in your organization. A leader balances the organization's concern for performance, people, and process. And so as it relates to diversity, if you are thinking about the performance of your organization, but not necessarily looking at the internal workings as it relates to the people, then that may be a place where as a leader, you can focus more energy. A leader holds the organization, their peers, and themselves accountable. So a leader doesn't just look at everyone else, but looks at themselves and determines, am I doing what's right for this organization? So whether that be in the structure and policies, a leader facilitates the people to be successful, make sure that they're all treated equitably and fairly, and keeps them engaged while still reaching the organization's performance goals. At the end of the day, the leader sets the tone for the organizational culture as it relates to your stance on racism, anti-racism, exclusion versus inclusion, microaggressions, and lack of diversity in the workplace. These are all things that we're going to talk about today. There are three areas when we talk about leadership and diversity, and this is actually taken from a philosophy that the US military uses, in that leaders be, they know, and they do. In terms of being, a leader believes in what they're doing. That includes their beliefs, their character. They outwardly show that so that the rest of the employee base understands where they stand. Leaders share their personal diversity and inclusion beliefs and know how they can drive value for the individual, group, and organization. One of the things that I always do when I'm working with my clients is that I ask them to make the leadership team, to make a personal diversity commitment statement, so that when they're working with people in their organization, there's no surprise and there's no misunderstanding of where that leader stands as it relates to diversity. Also in the B category, leaders demonstrate their character by their willingness to understand and incorporate diverse points of view within a larger context. So a leader has the responsibility of understanding and incorporating diverse points of view. Leaders take personal responsibility for diversity and inclusion failures and share its successes with their team. So when it comes up short, the leader will take responsibility for that. But when there is a success, the leader shares that across the board. In terms of knowing, what leaders know, including their job and human skills and knowledge, diversity inclusion leaders invest in developing their individual and team diversity and inclusion competencies and skill sets. So a leader will put actual money behind understanding. So whether that includes training, education, workshops, a diversity leader will make sure that he or she understands by developing their own and their team's understanding and knowledge of diversity. Leaders ensure that there's an understanding of how D&I supports the organization's overall strategy. We'll talk about strategy in a second, but it's understood, and it's been widely researched, that diverse teams are exponentially more successful, more profitable than non-diverse teams. And that goes for-profit businesses and nonprofit businesses. A diverse board is wildly more successful than a non-diverse board, simply because they can bring a diversity and innovation in thought, approaches. And so leaders ensure that there's an understanding of how that actually works, and they share that with their team. Leaders help employees or team members link their individual contributions to the success of the diversity and inclusion initiative to the business. So a leader will help those within their organization, whether we're talking about board members, employees, to understand how their contributions are linked to this concept of diversity. And then finally, leaders communicate the ongoing status of the diversity and inclusion impact and its implications. So we'll talk in a second about measurement and how it's a leader's responsibility to ensure that what you are doing actually gets measured and what's being measured is actually done. So a leader communicates the status as it relates to diversity initiatives. And then finally, so we talked about what leaders be, what leaders know. What do leaders do in terms of implementing, motivating, and providing direction around diversity? Diversity and inclusion leaders support development of customized goals, values, and concepts that are relevant to their external markets, yet have internal goals specific to their work environments. So a leader ensures that from a strategic initiative standpoint, that diversity is built into what they're implementing, and they use that to motivate and provide direction in terms of where they want to go with diversity. Leaders clarify roles and responsibilities as it relates to diversity, and leaders differentiate between the culture and climate. So when we talk transformational leadership, specifically as it relates to diversity and inclusion, the leader acknowledges that cultural norms and limitations may exist, but they lead their team beyond that. And finally, leaders demonstrate personal courage of conviction. They motivate others to step into their own greatness. It's understood that we don't grow from within our comfort zone. We grow when we're outside of our comfort zone. So leaders create a safe space so that the employees and other people within the organization can feel comfortable discussing topics of diversity, discussing topics of exclusion versus inclusion, and then that leader helps them to grow through that point. So a lot of organizations ask, or when I'm working with them, they ask, well, we are already a pretty diverse organization. What is it that we should be doing? And what you see on the screen right now is a continuum on becoming an anti-racist, multicultural organization. On the left-hand side, you'll see it says exclusive, an exclusionary institution. And all the way on the right side, you see fully inclusive, anti-racist, multicultural organization in a transformed society. Most companies fall somewhere in the middle. On the left, this would be companies, not many of these actually exist anymore, but this would be companies that on their books and in their policies, in their handbooks, they actually have exclusionary practices that they promote and that they stand by. On the complete right side, you have companies and organizations that are fully embracing of a multicultural organization, to the point where externally into the community, they feel a responsibility to build multicultural and diverse programming, multicultural, inclusive, and diverse output from their organization. As I said, most companies fall somewhere in the middle, where they tout and they have statements and they can discuss diversity, but there's still some either unwritten rules, some examples of tokenism, or even though it may not be explicitly stated, there's a glass ceiling, whether that be for ethnic minorities, whether that be gender-based. There are still things in place that are keeping the organization from fully embracing diversity. And so what we teach is that not only must you state it and overtly talk about what you're doing, but you have to take a first internal look at how are our policies in support of hiring and recruiting the best talent, regardless of race. How are our retention policies as it relates to minorities and women? How are our promotion rates as it relates to those as well? And so finding yourself in this continuum, But then more importantly, discussing or deciding what am I going to do about this is extremely important. And so what do we do about this? Companies ask all the time, right? What's our responsibility? How do we change this? So we know that we support diversity. We know that we don't want to be exclusionary. We know that we want to be an inclusive environment. And I ask four questions. First of all, do you know your organization's statement or stance on diversity? More importantly, do you even have one? I think that it is just as important when you're thinking about your strategic plan to think through your strategic diversity plan. Does your organization have a statement or stance on diversity? And do you know what that is? Secondly, what specific actions is your organization taking to realize truth in that statement? A statement is just a statement. It's just like your mission statement, your vision statement, anything else. If there are not specific actions that support that statement, if there are not behavior changes that support that statement, then are you actually getting any closer to realizing truth in that statement? So the third point is, or the third question is, how those actions roll up to the bigger organizational strategy. So your organizational statement on diversity, the specific actions your organization is taking or is willing to take, and then does that actually roll into your organization's strategy? And then finally, how is that being measured? A leader's responsibility is to ensure that what gets measured gets done, and what we're trying to accomplish is actually being measured. And so if you're stating that we stand in solidarity or we have a specific role that we want to play internally, externally as it relates to diversity, then what are the metrics that you're using to actually measure diversity within your organization? And that has to be more than just, do we have bodies and seats? It is, again, as I stated before, more than just a spread of diverse individuals, but looking at your retention rates, looking at your recruitment policies and the results of your recruitment. And for nonprofit organizations, some of them are small in terms of their staff. And so when we talk about recruitment, we're talking about board recruitment as well. We're talking about volunteer recruitment. Are your programs that are designed to recruit people into your organization skewed towards attracting one type of person? Looking at our selection processes. So when we are selecting programming, when we're selecting awardees, when we're selecting people that we're funding, what do those criteria look like, or what does that criteria look like that we're using for the selection process? And so when we're going out into the community to do work, are we putting barriers in place that are excluding diverse individuals, not only from being successful, but from even wanting to be a part of our organization? As I said before, promotion, development is a big one. I work with a client now, and on the externally, it looks like they don't have many issues as it relates to equity. But when you start to talk with some of the employees, they say things anecdotally. They say things like, I was guilty of some type of infraction, but so was one of my coworkers. That coworker received training, mentoring, and a development plan where I was demoted and basically got a slap on the wrist, as opposed to being uplifted to become better. So we have to look at our development unwritten policies and how some unconscious bias might skew who we determine deserves development versus who we determine deserves the demerit. Pay and benefits is pretty simple. That is, are people who otherwise are the same, other than gender or ethnicity, right? Are they being paid on the same scale? Does a Black woman in your organization who's doing the same job and at the same level make the same as a white man in your organization? Employee engagement. So sometimes we will say, yes, we're a diverse organization. We have diversity across the ranks. And yes, we are an equitable organization. People are being paid the same. People are being promoted at the same rates. But then we look at inclusion. So from an employee engagement standpoint, does everyone within your organization feel like not only do they have a say or a seat at the table, but do they feel a sense of belonging? Do they feel engaged with the rest of the employee base? Do they feel engaged when you're having social outings? Do they feel like their words are taken just as seriously in the decision-making process as other employees? So from an employee engagement standpoint, how are you measuring that? And often that's done with an employee engagement assessment or done with culture climate assessments. Employee focus groups. Do you have affinity groups? Do you have diversity councils? Do you have things that can help the larger employee base understand some of the challenges with being, a minority employee within your place of work? Do you have any type of executive council that says, before we make some decisions, we want to at least acknowledge and ask the diversity council if there's any additional input based on their understanding of diversity that should be added into our decision-making process. Exit interviews. A lot of companies do exit interviews, but do you ask specific questions of your diverse employees during the exit interview if there was anything that either the lack of diversity or the lack of inclusion may have played in their decision to leave the firm or the company? And then you can see the others: employer brand, grievances and lawsuits, customer diversity, experience and loyalty, and supplier diversity. These are all things that, as a leader, you should or could put in place to actually measure your success at building a diverse and inclusive organization and environment. If you're not doing all of these things, I would say pick the ones that make the most sense. It may be impossible to measure every single step or every single one of these concepts, but there are at least some that you can incorporate into your organizational measurements if you're not already doing so. Now, when talking about recruiting and hiring, there's a concept that we talked through that's called moving from culture fit to culture add. Often an unseen barrier that, and it's an artificial barrier that we put in place, is during the hiring process, we'll ask if this person is a right fit culturally for our organization. They may have all the technical skills, they may have all of the degrees, but we're looking at our own affinity bias and asking, would this candidate fit in culturally at our organization? And there's some merits to having cultural fit. It preserves continuity. It ensures, at least at the beginning, that there won't be much conflict because everyone has a similar either background or outlook or experiences. But what it detracts from is your organization's ability to look forward to the future. And so what we say is you don't necessarily need to replace, but you need to balance this need for cultural fit with the need for cultural addition. So moving from culture fit to culture add means during the hiring process, during the recruiting process, switch your lens to look at potential candidates and ask, is this person someone who can add to our culture here within this organization? Can they bring some differences that allow or force us to look at some of the solutions that we have in place a little differently? Can they bring some new experiences, some new background, some new lenses to how we're looking through our solutions, our workplace? And so when we talk about culture add, we're asking the question, what are we missing? And you're moving the organization from confirmation to learning. And so moving from culture fit to culture add is a very specific way, at least in the hiring and the recruiting process, that as a leader, you can start to shift the culture within your organization. So microaggressions, here's one that it's getting a lot of buzz lately. It's actually been around for a while, but people are often saying, I feel like our organization has some microaggressive tendencies. What can I do? What are microaggressions and what can I do to avoid those? Well, microaggressions are, in my definition, they are subtle acts of exclusion. They can be comments, they can be actions, but they're things that are even sometimes well-meaning by we'll say by the offender. They'll make a comment, they'll make a statement, they'll do an action that they think has little meaning, or it's even intended to be a compliment. but it turns out to actually be something that is derogatory or negative in nature. And some examples, and these are some examples, some of these examples I've actually experienced myself, when someone will walk up to a minority, a ethnic minority, someone from another country or a different race, and say things like, you're so articulate, you don't sound Black, or, you are a tribute to your race. And what they're trying to say to me is, okay, you sound intelligent or you're articulate. But in fact, what they're saying is, I consider you to be an outlier from other people of your background. I consider you to be an outlier from Black people because I don't think that Black people sound articulate. So by saying you sound so articulate, you don't sound Black, you're saying I don't consider Black people to be articulate and you're different. Or when they say things like, I'm not colorblind. When I look at you, I don't see color. That was a big one several years ago. A lot of people moved to this, colorblind sort of philosophy. And what I would say is a better interpretation of what you really mean is that you should be color conscious, but that you don't place value or importance in terms of your ability to execute successfully, complete tasks, just be successful with color. So I look at colors and I say, I see Black people. I see people of different ethnicities. I see all of this and I value them for what they're bringing to the table. Not that we're in some, monolithic blank slate and everyone is the same. People are different, but that doesn't mean that the differences equate to devalue or that the differences equate to lesser ability. I judge your ability based on your ability, but I do see you and all of your experiences and everything that you bring to the table. And so microaggressions, and we could do an entire series on, how what some of those microaggressions are. There are so many different examples, and then what you can do about it. I'll talk a little bit about, what we can do to not necessarily avoid microaggressions, because that takes some education on what are microaggressive statements, but what we can do about it in the workplace when we're faced with microaggressions. So education is the key. There are some things that on a base level, we just need to be smarter about. But once there is an actual offensive statement that could be considered microaggressive, three things that we talk about are making the invisible visible, educating the offender, and disarming the microaggression. And so you do that by focusing specifically on what was offensive about it. I don't focus on the intent because I can't judge intent. I can only discuss what was actually said. So if someone says, hey, she looks like an Aunt Jemima, the person saying that may not actually know that the whole Aunt Jemima imagery and a lot of the other imagery that has been accepted across American culture, these are actually derogatory images of Black slaves, Black house workers, minstrel shows even. And so by educating the offender, not necessarily on their intent, but saying, hey, did you know that that imagery that you're referencing and that you're using in this conversation is part of a pattern of racist imagery that was perpetuated throughout the early 20th century, right, and into the late 19th century. And you shouldn't use that because, and then explain why it's offensive to people in the workplace. That's a better discussion, and just confronting it straight on, then moving away from that and asking the person, what are some of the things that we can do to ensure that we don't use those types of statements here at work? I cringed the other day. I was watching, I was actually watching a documentary about Black ballet dancers in different parts of the United States. And one of the ballet dancers actually said, she referred to herself as some type of Nazi. She said, I'm the, ballet Nazi, or, something like that. And I understood what she was trying to say. But at the same time, I empathized and put my feet in someone else's shoes and said, if I am a survivor of the Holocaust, or I am the descendant of a survivor of the Holocaust, or not even a survivor, if I'm a descendant of someone who lost their lives in the Holocaust, having someone in my workplace refer to themselves as any type of Nazi, while they may have meant it to be completely innocent, and they're not equating those words that they're using with the Holocaust, they don't have the right to determine how I may be offended by that statement. And so there are all these statements that are made every day in the workplace that are offensive in nature. They may, by the offender, seem to be, you know, not so critical or not that offensive, but you have to empathize and put yourself in everyone else's shoes to understand what the context may be. I have another client that recently had a bit of a crisis on their hands where they had a guest on one of their shows, and the guest was a Harlem Globetrotter, the basketball players. And he was talking about how, and this is an African-American gentleman, young man, I think he was around 24 years old. He was talking about how to be a Harlem Globetrotter, you have to have excellent hand-eye coordination, and that you have to be able to dribble a basketball, while juggling things, and et cetera. And so the hosts of the show decided that and this was not a rehearsed, this wasn't a practice skit, but they decided that they would throw some things to him while he was dribbling the basketball to test his hand-eye coordination. And what they decided to throw to him or at him was a banana. They didn't understand the nature of Black men, particularly, in the turn of the last century, not, going into the 2000s, but going into the 1900s, how Black men were actually locked in cages and treated like animals with fruit thrown to them in the Brooklyn Zoo, right? And so the Harlem Globetrotter, which is, an organization from New York, and this guy was from New York, he very much understood the historical significance of throwing fruit to or at a Black man. The people who were the offenders in the situation didn't understand. And so part of getting past this was explaining the historical significance, educating them first, not necessarily just going in an all-out indictment mode and saying, here's all the things you did wrong. We did work with them on an apology, but part of it was educating them on why you don't do this specific act. And so I think we're getting past it. I think we all came together, but I use those anecdotal sort of stories to explain that some microaggressions stem from a lack of education or misunderstanding of what is appropriate and what's inappropriate. So as a leader, part of setting a culture of inclusivity is to have everyone understand that your way of thinking or your experiences don't necessarily equate to the only or right way, and that there are people that could be offended, hurt by your actions, and that we have to learn how to speak and dialogue through those things. Best practices in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and this is integration across functions. So earlier we talked about some of the things that you can do, particularly in large organizations. We see that they actually formulate divisions within the organization to address either lack of diversity or to ensure that they have diversity. And so from a workforce standpoint, again, we talked about recruitment and retention, succession planning and pipeline development is important. It's one thing to track your promotions. It's another thing to ensure that we actually have a plan of how groups of people, whether it be based on race, whether it be based on gender or anything else, actually have a pipeline into being a success within your organization, into being promoted into executive ranks. I recently spoke with an NFL organization, and anyone who's familiar with the NFL knows that traditionally or historically, for the first 75 years of the NFL, there had never been, and I don't know that exact number, but for many, many years, for decades in the NFL, there had never been any Black head coaches or Black executives. And so in order to help support Black coaches being considered, they came up with a new rule called the Rooney Rule. And that is, whenever you have an opening for head coach on your team, you have to have at least one Black candidate that is being considered and interviewed for the job. But what they didn't do is ensure that on the selection and hiring committee, there were also minorities. And so what you have is often an all-white committee looking at 4 candidates, one of those candidates being an ethnic minority, but still being passed over or not being given, an equal opportunity. The NFL has changed. There are many more Black head coaches now, and I shouldn't say many. There are some Black head coaches now, but this concept of succession planning and pipeline development has to take it a step further than just ensuring people are in the pipeline. It has to ensure that they are receiving the same mentoring, the same grooming to be successful, and that on the selection committees, people are being educated as to their own bias when making these selections. Otherwise, you may just get the same results that you've always had. Some of the other functions on here, Eeo and Legal Compliance. A lot of companies are doing well at that because these are actual laws that ensure that from a policy standpoint, you are not discriminating. But again, going back to this concept of diversity councils, affinity groups, training and education, here's where you as a leader can ensure that you're actually investing time and money into your diverse candidates, or not just diverse candidates, but including diversity as part of your culture. Are you putting the same effort, the same money behind training and diversity as you would training in your other strategic initiatives? Supplier diversity, communications, advertising. Are we looking at our external suppliers? Are we looking at how we're communicating externally from our organization and how we're advertising? Are we putting some of the community at large, particularly when you're a nonprofit, because you're not a for-profit company and you're not owned by a specific entity, but you're actually owned by the community, you're owned by the state with which you exist. Are you thinking through the people and the communities that support your organization from a diverse standpoint? Are you thinking through all of those constituents when you're thinking about how you're communicating back out into the community? When you're thinking about spending your advertising dollars, your multicultural marketing and sales, are you including those groups as well? And so there are a set of commitment actions that we often work with our clients on, or that I work with people on, or that I suggest, because all of the talk about diversity and all of the, here's what we're facing in our place, but what can we do about it? Well, there are some very specific things that you can do. The first thing is commitment from your C-suite, from your chief executives, from the board of directors, from the top management, that this is something important for you. I talked earlier about the leadership team creating their own diversity commitment statements. That's a first step. If you create that, you share it with your team, at least the team understands where you stand as it relates to diversity. Having a diversity and inclusion officer. This, depending on the size of your organization, this may not be a full-time position, but at least having someone, whether it's full-time, I would suggest that larger organizations have a full-time person, but if that's not feasible, if that's not capable, at least building in the concept of diversity and inclusion as a formal part of someone's role to look at these concepts, to measure these, the statistics around these areas, that should be someone's formal role within your organization. Again, the strategic plan, ensuring that when you talk about your value statements, when you talk about your strategic initiatives, what gets measured gets done. So within your strategic plan, are you building in these ideas around increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion? Executive Diversity and Inclusion Council, having at the upper, the highest ranks within your organization, do we have people who are part of the C-suite also sitting on an executive diversity council? And then you can see the others, an integrated organization. That's one of the goals that we can commit as an action. Measurement and benchmarking systems, having real benchmarks, where are we starting from? Where are we trying to be, so that we can measure it each step of the way? We talked about multicultural marketing and sales. Diversity as impetus for the development of new products and services. Even if that product isn't, a hard commodity, it's not something that you're necessarily selling, but it's a program that you're implementing. Are you having, are you including diversity in your thought as you create this program? Community and philanthropic ties. This is actually important for community-based organizations because, and I'll go back to the banana throwing incident for a second. I was working with this organization on their response to this and crisis management. And one of the questions that I asked them was, at this point, anything that you do is going to seem very reactionary unless you already have ties in the community from a diversity standpoint that can stand with you and that can speak to the fact that you're not, in this instance, a racist organization. The people who threw the fruit, you knew what their intentions were, you've known them for years. Can you have someone who represents the community be able to speak on their behalf as you formulate your own apology? But if you don't have that already built into your relationships, if you haven't already been supporting, diverse philanthropic organizations, and when it comes to a crisis, now you are shifting your focus there, people will see it as disingenuous or inauthentic. And then again, this whole concept of supplier diversity as well. So those are just some of my thoughts around how we can increase, or a leadership and a leader's responsibility on increasing diversity. For me, it all boils back down to, are you strategically building it into your plans, or is it an afterthought? Are you measuring it each step of the way, or are you just using some anecdotal examples to say that, we embrace diversity? And when you make these statements, are your behaviors and actions in support of that actual statement, or is it just ending with the statement?
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us for the second session of the virtual Take 5 Nonprofit Leadership Conference. We're now going to move into the Q&A session with our keynote speaker, Ahli Moore. Please use the Q&A feature to ask your questions. And we have a few questions already. First, in your consulting, have you ever encountered individuals who, despite all the education, do not buy into the organization's diversity program? And if so, how did you deal with them?
So the short answer is yes. I think depending on the size of the organization, there are always going to be people who don't agree with this as an important topic. But with that being said, I would first caution people in always, or not always, but referring to this as a program, right? Diversity is something that has no end to it, or the focus on diversity has no end to it. And so because of that, while we have goals and we have places that we want to reach, it's not a one-time event. It's not a training session. It's not, we went and heard a speaker on diversity and now we have all the answers. It's an ongoing, continuously evolving topic and focus area. Now, when I've been in a situation, whether it was a company that I was consulting for or a company that I worked for, and there were people who were not on board, I would say that there were a number of things that we could do. The first thing is moving away from referring to it as a program to referring to it as the culture that we're trying to build within this organization, right? And when we talk organizational values and we talk organizational culture, just like any of the other things that you stand for, if it is important enough for your organization to embrace it, and you have employees who, or someone there who isn't a decision maker, but also says, hey, I'm not on board with this direction, I'm not going to adhere to the organizational values, then that person is not the right fit for your organization. It's interesting when it comes to diversity, because we talk about organizational values, and it's never difficult to say this person isn't in line with what this organization stands for. If they aren't ready to be educated on some of these topics, or they're not even willing to embrace the discussion around these things, we're going to get rid of them. But then when it comes to diversity, we always refer to it as these difficult conversations, these difficult topics. And what I would say, and one of the reasons why I always tie it back to the strategic plan is, if it's ingrained and incorporated into the higher level of strategy that your organization has put together, then it's a no-brainer that if someone doesn't want to be a part of what your organization stands for, that you could, get rid of them. The other thing that I would say when faced with someone like that is to show them or help them understand the value of diversity from the bottom line perspective, your return on investment, your ability to make more money, your ability to save more money, your ability to attract more volunteers to your nonprofit or more members into your organization. All of these things have a positive correlation to diversity, because diversity has, it enhances our innovation. It enhances our ability to think through better solutions and more opportunities and more options. It also enhances our ability to be successful as an organization. And then finally, from a leader perspective, sometimes the leaders have to make the hard calls. Sometimes the leaders have to say, this is the direction that we're moving in. If there are people or a person who isn't in line with the direction that we're moving in as an organization, well, then, that person might not be the right person to continue being a part of what we're doing.
Great point on moving from culture fit to culture add. How do leaders make that change within themselves?
Okay, so again, I speak about all of these things because my background is in organizational culture change, and I always look at change as an evolutionary process. Moving from culture fit to culture add is something that the leader herself or himself should be asking, am I doing everything that I can to ensure that this organization that I'm leading is here for the long haul, that we have put together the right strategy for sustainability? And part of that is looking at the places where we have traditionally hired the same person, the same type of person to fill the same role. And that's why we may have plateaued. Maybe that's why we've stagnated. Are there opportunities for us to enhance our organization by looking at this from a different lens, and that lens being culture add as opposed to culture fit? And so if a leader is doing her responsibility or his responsibility, if they're doing that effectively, they're always looking at, how can I positively evolve the organization? And for me, if you're doing that as a leader, then it should be a no-brainer to ask, where are there gaps between where we want to be and where we currently are? And is it because we're playing it too safe in terms of the type of person or the type of thought process that people have that we're bringing in? And that can but that can be resolved in part by bringing in more diverse people.
Are people with disabilities included in the scope of diversity?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. We talk about marginalized groups, people with disabilities, just like race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. There are people who are discriminated against or not even given an opportunity to be engaged based on cognitive and physical disabilities. And so to that extent, yes, I would include them in the discussion on diversity.
Many organizations conduct formal training on sexual harassment in the workplace. Would you recommend expanding these training programs to include diversity matters and how diversity issues also contribute to a hostile work environment?
Yes, absolutely. This is where, when we talk about moving from a statement to actual actions, in your budget for training, are you investing dollars into education around diversity? I also want to speak a little bit about what diversity training, right, could be. There are people, currently there's a movement to ban diversity training. An executive order was signed at the federal level to eliminate any funding for federally funded organizations that are sponsoring diversity training. So diversity in and of itself cannot be solved by training. But when we talk about training, training has so many different connotations and textures. there are training courses that I teach myself that are specifically based on understanding your own unconscious bias, unpacking the impact that it may have had on you. Were you a victim of it? Are you, because it's unconscious, are you playing a role in it and not even knowing it, right? And so training, there are so many different topics, the importance of multiculturalism and the difference between multiculturalism versus color blindness, intent versus impact, cultural intelligence. These are all things that fall within training for diversity. These are all things that are important for well-rounded, intelligent professionals to understand how this may be impacting their own workforce. And so to the extent that the leader can recognize this and say, this might be important information for my people to understand, even if we're not faced with overt racism or overt discrimination within our workplace, these might be topics that we've never even considered may be impacting some of the people in our workplace. And so we want to provide an opportunity for open discussions around these. And so that leader then putting money in terms of investing into training courses around this topic is an example of actually, putting your money where your mouth is and actually walking the talk. So I would absolutely say the same way that you invest in sexual harassment training, invest in diversity or microaggression training or unconscious bias training also.
How do you encourage staff to have open conversations when leadership tends to think that they need to ignore the problem?
So some people could consider this to be a really easy, straightforward answer, but it's difficult because if your staff and your livelihood and your paycheck is contingent upon others who may not share the same perspective as you, I would say that staff could encourage leadership by bringing this topic to them as an opportunity. Instead of discussing it from a negative or deficit framing perspective, bring it to them as, I have a vision for closing the gap in certain areas of our workforce, and it's going to take some courage. It's going to take you putting yourself out there, potentially, but at the same time, if done properly and approaching this properly as an opportunity for growth, an opportunity to ensure that our organization is here for the future, these topics are going to pop up eventually, right? And for a leader to say, okay, I'm not interested, or I don't think it's important, you could frame it for that leader and say, this is going to happen where you have to address something that is related to diversity or lack of diversity or discrimination or exclusion or something along those lines. Do we as an organization want to be proactive and close the gaps and tend to this, or do we want to be reactionary and wait for some incident to happen, or for us to have a high turnover rate among our diverse employees, or for us to not be able to attract the best and brightest of diverse employees because they don't see this as a great place to work? Do we want to react to that, or do we want to be proactive? And so I think, going back to the essence of the question, how do you encourage staff to have these discussions? I think you can frame it in a positive perspective that you are helping the leader and you're helping the organization to be successful.
If an organization wishes to expand the diversity of its board of directors, can you provide an example of how they might approach their selection process to identify potential candidates, to identify and recruit to address this?
Okay. Well, first of all, particularly as it relates to boards, you have to ask yourself, what's in it for that potential board member? What is it about what our board is doing or what our organization is doing and how our board operates in support of that would attract a diverse candidate to want to be a part of our board? If we are serving a community, but we don't have diversity built into our programming, or we don't have diversity built into who we're funding or who we're helping, why would a diverse candidate want to come and be a part of that? And so I think part of our responsibility as members and leaders of nonprofit boards is to take a deep dive into what would attract a diverse person to be a part of this. And if there are gaps in what we're doing strategically, maybe that's the incentive, that you have recognized that our organization is not participating at the level, or not just doesn't exist at the level that we want it to. And one of the reasons why we think this is because we don't have diversity within our board. And so we're not looking to fill a slot, a token slot with a diverse person to check the box and say we have a diverse person in a role here on our board. We're looking to bring more diversity of thought, more diversity of experience, more diversity in terms of what this person could potentially help us to do. And so that way, the person who you are attracting or who you are targeting to bring onto the board isn't looking at this as, a token position. They're looking at it as, they really want my perspective as a diverse individual to add diversity to their board.
Is there a way to measure whether your diversity efforts are making your organization more successful?
Yeah, it's a tough question, simply because there are so many variables that are involved, right? When you're talking for-profit businesses, you can easily say, did we make more money this year than we made last year? Are our revenues higher? Are our expenses lower? And what can we attribute that to? Different product offerings, different operational changes, et cetera. When the focus of your company or your organization isn't on specifically making money, then it's a little more it's more difficult. However, just because you're a nonprofit doesn't mean that you don't have, fiduciary responsibilities, and that your revenue in terms of, your budget isn't an important part of the discussion. What I would say, particularly as it relates to nonprofits, look at what your increase in diversity from a board perspective, your increase in diversity from a staff perspective has done to your membership. What has it done to the goals that your organization has set forth in terms of your community reach, in terms of your programming? And if you can point to increased membership, increased programming, increased participation in your programs that link directly back to new ideas, or that link back to things that your diverse staff, your newly increased diverse staff or increased diversity on your board have brought to the table, or that they've recommended, or that they suggested, then that's an easy correlation. In terms of long-term metrics, I would say that you use the metrics that you already have in place. There are metrics around diversity, clearly, and those are things like representation and promotion rates and turnover rates, things like that. But in terms of your success of your organization, it's a long-term measure, because you have to look at, if we're measuring the same things, the same level of success that we've had using the same tools and the same measurements that we've always used, but we've seen an uptick, what can we attribute that to? And if the only change in our organization is that we've increased our diversity within the board and within our staff, then maybe that is a positive correlation, and you can tie those things back to that increase in diversity.
Do you have recommendations for key priorities for a small, mostly volunteer organization to integrate diversity and equity principles into their culture?
Yeah, it's not too different than a large organization. And I understand with small organizations, just purely off numbers, having a 4-person organization or a 6-person organization is different than having a 400-person or 600-person organization. But I would say, look at the community that you serve, the community that supports you. And if you have a board that is made up of 6 people, 8 people, 12 people, whatever your board is, and you look at the community that you're serving, and the community is 8%, 25%, 30, 40% African American or Latino or Latinx or whatever it may be. If your goal is to equitably represent the community that your organization comes from or that supports your organization, then at a minimum, you should have that same type of representation on your board. From a culture standpoint, look at the the programming within your organization and ask, do we offer programming that represents or includes all of the community that we serve? If there's anything about our programming that inherently excludes any part, whether it's formally written or informal by policies, is there anything that we're doing culturally that is dissuading people from wanting to be a part of what we're doing? Right. And sometimes we look at our policies, we look at our written policies, we look at our handbooks, we look at everything, and we say our guiding principles and everything. And we say, no, there's nothing here. But the proof is in whether we have attracted diverse people to our board or if we have attracted diverse members into our organization. And if we haven't done either one of those things, or diverse participants in our programming, if none of those things are happening, then we have to take even a deeper dive, a deeper look into the practices, our marketing campaigns, our, all of the both internal and external things that we're doing, and determine for ourselves whether there are gaps there. And if we still can't do it, that's where people like me come in and help do equity audits for you, and look at, longitudinal studies and understand historically how some of your decisions may have played a role in where you are now.
In implementing changes to an organization's culture to address diversity, should the organization also develop a plan to communicate to stakeholders, program participants, and donors the reasons and benefits of its actions?
So I approached this from my own lens. This is my opinion, but I say yes. There are people who would say, well, we're at risk. I'm actually working with a university right now who says that, if we communicate all of these things, we're at risk of losing some funding from some boosters for our athletic programs. And my response to them was, at some point, you have to draw your line in the sand of what you stand for and what you don't stand for. I'm a person who is very much a proponent of transparency. And so to communicate what we're doing and why we're doing it is important to me. And to that extent, if there are people who receive that message and disagree with what we're doing, I have to now, as a leader, make what could be a tough decision on, well, is this person, is this booster, is this supporter still the type of person that I want supporting my organization? Is the money that I'm receiving from them more important than the philosophical stance or, our approach to this topic? And we have to find what our approach is. We started this entire conversation, not just the Q&A part, but even in the video, with being more than a statement. But in that statement, do you actually stand by your statement? And if so, then from my perspective, you shouldn't have a problem with explaining that. And if your statement is that this isn't important to us, stand by that as well. Let's see on balance whether your statement of this is who we are and this is what we embrace and this is why we do it stands up to your statement if you choose to say we don't embrace these things and this is the reason why. If you feel comfortable enough to, communicate that, let's see what that gets you in terms of your long-term sustainability, right? And so back to the question, I think that communicating tactfully, but being open and honest about what we're doing and why we're doing it is important to actually living what you state.
There are those who abuse their differences or diversity. How do you deal with those individuals manipulating others to cause division in your organization?
Wow. So those, if I'm understanding the question, is it from the perspective of a diverse individual manipulating this idea of diversity to cause division?
I believe that's the question, yes.
Okay. Well, I would say that education around diversity is, I go back to this for me and the way that I do my practice. And by the way, there was a slight gaffe in the beginning of our entire presentation today where it said I had 15 years of consulting experience. It's actually 25 years of consulting experience. I wish I was young enough to say it was only 15 years, but it's 25 years. But throughout my career, whether it be diversity or not diversity, but any type of organizational change, it's education, but it's education through conversation and through discussions. We're adults. Adults don't learn by getting lectured to. Adults don't learn by saying, okay, sit down for an hour. I'm going to tell you everything you need to know and go forward from here and be knowledgeable. We learn through experiential activities. We learn through ongoing conversation and discussion. And so as it relates to diversity, what I do with my clients and what I'm a giant proponent of is a training course may be part of the solution. It may be, but it may not be. What definitely is part of the solution is an open conversation where we invite people to come in and share their perspectives. We invite people to share their experiences. We invite people to share what's working for them in our workplace and what's not working for them in our workplace. And to the extent that we can identify gaps in our approach to diversity, equity, and inclusion through those conversations, then those are areas that we can address. If we feel like there's someone or some people who are trying to take advantage of our focus on diversity, we can sniff that out as well, because I've had to have conversations with people, and I've been part of many of these conversations over the years, whether it be with a client or outside of my work, where someone is saying, hey, I've been discriminated against. They explain what happened, and then I offer to them additional perspectives that maybe it wasn't discrimination after all. Maybe in their execution of tasks that they're responsible for on their job, they're just not that good. And so it's not discrimination. It would be discrimination if the person to the left and right of you are doing the exact same thing, but you're the only person who is being, who receives some sort of negative impact from it, right? But if you're just not good at what you do and therefore you get fired, right, that's not discrimination. And so through these conversations and through these ongoing, workshops, that's where you can start to help and educate the workforce on what is diversity, what is racism, what are we considering to be discriminatory here versus what's not, how do we ensure that there is inclusion and not exclusion. And at the same time, if it has been determined that someone is purposely trying to divide the workforce, then I would say, regardless of whether this is a diverse individual, a non-diverse individual, our goal and our responsibility as leaders is for the well-being of the organization and the people that make up this organization, the staff, the employees, and the people that this organization targets in terms of its participation. If there's anyone who is purposely trying to divide us, keep us stagnant, ensure that we can't accomplish our goals, then that's a person that, it's up to the leader. But for me, that would be a person that's no longer welcome to be a part of our organization, regardless of who they are.
Thanks for joining us. Be sure to register for the final session, So You Had to Cancel Your Fundraising Event. Now what? With Nicole Sturk of SICSA on October 20th. We look forward to seeing you soon. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.